The issue I'm talking about is the level of access a collaborator has to both your public or private repository. When talking about personal user accounts, and that's the case we have at the moment here, the access such collaborators have is quite huge, to be honest. To dive into this, I opened the official GitHub docs because I think the docs give you a great overview of this access level collaborators have. You can of course find the link to this page attached to this lecture. Now, on this page, you can find out a lot about the general permission levels of the owner of a repository, in the case of a personal user account, and also about the rights of collaborators. If you scroll down a bit, you can find here the owner access for the repository owned by a user account. So that's basically my core account we are using in the course. And here you can see lots of actions the owner has, and that's important, in addition to the actions that any collaborator can perform. You can read through these if you want to. There is actually one important thing though when it comes to limiting the actions, the interactions a user can have. And that's the limit interactions part right here. This one, limit interactions in your repository. We'll have a look at these in a few seconds. Before we do that though, if we scroll down further, you can find information about the collaborator access for a repository owned by a user account. That's basically the access type the other user has that we added to our account here in the example. And you can again dive into the different rights a collaborator has, but the most important one in my opinion is this node right here. As you can see, in a private repository, repository owners can only grant write access to collaborators. This means collaborators can't have read-only access to repositories owned by a user account. Why am I emphasizing this? Well, you might have the case where you want to invite somebody to your project and you want to show this code of the project to this person, but the person should not have had write access. What you actually need is this read-only access type that we are, referring to right here. Generally, in a private user account, this is not possible. This means we need to have another account type to achieve this. We'll dive into this in a few minutes. First, I want to show you one restriction option you have though, and that's the option I referred to right here, this limit interactions with the repository option up here. Let's have a look at this option as a next step, and then we'll leave the personal user account and dive into organizations, because there we have more options to tailor the specific access rights a specific user or specific member of the organization has. Restricting access to our repository is very important. We of course know the difference between the public and the private repository. We are currently in the private one, but even inside this repository, in our personal user account, we have some options to limit the interactions or the permission of other users. To find out more about these, keep in mind we are still in the private repository up here, you can go to your, profile user settings, so to say. There, go down to settings, right here. And there, scroll down now, in the left part here in this left column, to the moderation settings. There we either have the option to block specific users. If we click onto these, you can see we can prevent certain users from certain actions, which you can see up here. For this, you have to enter the username, full name, or the email address of this user. But that's not what I want in here. That's a bit too strict for the purpose here. What I instead want to show you is the interaction limits option we just saw in the official docs, which you can find below that blocked users option. And in there, you can now temporarily restrict which external users can interact with your repositories. Now, very important, if you think about that logic here and the fact that we are in a private repository either way at the moment, you might ask yourselves, well, why would I want to do that? Well, Be aware that we are currently in my account settings. This means this temporary interaction limits refer to all repositories that I might have inside my account. For private repositories, well, that's not a real issue because no external person can access these repositories either way. But for public repositories, you can say that any public repositories I have, that for these repositories and for a specific amount of time, I want to set specific limits. That's exactly what you can do in here. And very important, even if you have repository specific limits, which we'll explore in a few seconds, these limits set right here will override these. So account specific limits always win against repository specific limits. What limits can be set here though? Well, we can, for example, restrict the interaction a new user can have with your repositories. You can see this only affects new users, not existing users, not contributors, and not collaborators. But you could say that for anybody who just created a GitHub account, you can say, okay, only people who have an account for, I don't know, more than a week, a month, or something like that, should be able to interact with my repository. You can also restrict interactions depending on any previous commits a person made to the default branch, so to the main branch, in any other of your repositories. That's the second option. Or you can say that only people who are, well, collaborators in one of my projects are allowed to interact with my other repositories. That's the third option right here. As you see, this is not very specific. We can, of course, block specific users in the other menu we have, but here we can just target specific user types, so to say, and not individual users. Besides the temporary interaction limits, which can be set right here, you can also set these on a per repository level, as I just said. For this, we have to go back to our account though, and there go to our GitHub Basics repository that we have right here. There go to the settings again, and there scroll down to the danger zone once again, and here change the visibility to public, because as I explained, it doesn't make sense to apply any of these settings on a per repository level. For private repositories, this limitation of interactions only makes sense for people, well, who could theoretically access your repository, and that would be the case for people, well, who access a public repository. Therefore, let's quickly change the visibility back to public, so we know the process in the meanwhile, like this, like that. Yes, we change it. And now in the settings, here I'm still inside the settings menu, if we scroll down, we can also find this moderation settings. You cannot find this menu option for private repositories. If we access these, we don't see, well, a big surprise here. We can find exactly the same options that we had before here on a repository specific level. You get also the information up here that you can, of course, also set these things in your account settings. That is what we previously did. So I just wanted to show you this. If you want to have some public repos not anybody should be allowed to interact with, and then this in theory would be a great way to do so. There are just two big problems here. The first problem is that, well, as I said, this cannot be applied on a specific user level, only on general, well, conditions that apply to certain users. And the second point is, if you closer inspect what interacting actually means, then you can find the definition up here. Interact means comment, open issues, or create pull requests. The problem is that these are all topics we didn't explore so far, but we talked about a topic we covered already. It's about, well, committing to a repository, and more specifically, we talked about granting read-only access, for example, to users which are collaborators. This means these temporary interaction limits are nice to have, but not as precise, not as specific as the requirement we might have here in our case. And this is the point where another account type comes into play finally: organizations.